Flying an airliner is a complex task. It's not just about getting from point A to point B. It involves careful coordination, precise decision-making, and the ability to handle unforeseen complications in a split second. Pilots are trained to manage emergencies, follow checklists, and make crucial decisions that impact the safety of their passengers, even in the face of adversity. The story of British Airways Flight 268 is one of those moments where a single decision, made in the heat of the moment, would spark controversy and bring about significant changes to the airline's policies and procedures. On the night of February 20th, 2005, a Boeing 747-400 took off from Los Angeles International Airport, bound for London Heathrow. The aircraft, carrying 352 passengers and 18 crew members, was scheduled for an 11-hour flight across the Atlantic. It should have been a routine flight, one that was expected to go smoothly. But just moments after takeoff, disaster struck. An engine surged, causing flames to shoot from the aircraft's left wing. The crew was faced with a life-altering decision: return to Los Angeles or continue to London as planned. What followed was a decision that would spark controversy, raise questions about airline policies, and highlight the ever-present tension between safety and operational considerations. The pilots of Flight 268 chose to continue the flight, and this decision would lead to more complications, both in the air and on the ground. As British Airways Flight 268 prepared for takeoff, the atmosphere at Los Angeles International Airport, LAX, was anything but serene. The weather outside was murky, with rain clouds hanging heavily over the airport and a fog that seemed to cling to the runway. Visibility was low, and the dreary atmosphere seemed to mirror the tension building inside the aircraft. Despite the unfavorable weather, the crew was ready. The 16-year-old Boeing 747-400, a reliable workhorse in British Airways' fleet, had just completed a long-haul flight from London and was now being prepped for its return journey. While the aircraft wasn't brand new, it was still considered a modern marvel, especially in 2005. The cockpit had been updated from the mechanical dials and levers of older models to sleek, modern CRT displays, which provided more relevant information to the pilots in an easily accessible format. This technological shift had eliminated the need for a flight engineer, streamlining operations and making flying at night more efficient. On board were 3 pilots: an extra first officer stationed in the jump seat behind the captain and first officer to allow them to rest during the long journey. This setup was typical for long-haul flights, ensuring that the pilots would remain alert and fresh for the duration of the trip. The crew's initial impression was that everything was going smoothly. The aircraft had been loaded with 119 metric tons of fuel, more than enough to get them to London. An additional 4 tons of fuel had been added to accommodate any delays that might arise. This decision would later play a crucial role in the outcome of the flight, as it provided the crew with enough flexibility to make adjustments when the unexpected occurred. After all passengers had boarded, the aircraft taxied toward runway 2 at LAX. The first officer was at the controls, while the captain observed from the right-hand seat. It was a clear division of labor. The first officer would fly, while the captain would monitor, ensuring that everything went according to plan. As the aircraft lined up on the runway, the pilots performed their final checks. The runway ahead stretched out into the rain-soaked night, the lights of the airport barely visible through the mist. At 9:20 p.m. local time, the first officer pushed the throttles forward and the massive engines roared to life. The aircraft accelerated down the runway, gaining speed and altitude as it moved through the night sky. Just over a minute into the flight, as the plane reached a safe altitude, a loud, repetitive thumping noise echoed through the cabin. The first officer felt the aircraft pull to the left. He quickly adjusted the controls to counter the movement, but it was clear that something was wrong. The pilot could see flames shooting out from beneath the aircraft's left wing. At this point, both the flight crew and passengers were aware that they were facing a critical situation. Inside the cockpit, the captain immediately recognized that the aircraft's left-hand engine, Engine 2, had started surging. An engine surge happens when there is a disruption in the airflow through the engine. The loud bangs heard by the crew were the result of the engine backfiring. On the cockpit instruments, the exhaust gas temperature was rising to dangerous levels. The situation was escalating, and the pilots needed to act fast to prevent further damage. Despite the severity of the situation, the pilots knew that an engine surge, while alarming, did not necessarily pose an immediate threat to the aircraft's safety. The Boeing 747 was a four-engine aircraft, and it could fly perfectly well with three engines functioning. The immediate concern was to assess the damage and determine whether the engine had caught fire or if the surge was simply a temporary issue. The captain brought the throttle for Engine 2 back toward the idle position, reducing the engine's power in an attempt to stabilize the situation. As soon as the throttle was reduced, the thumping sound stopped, and the flames appeared to subside. The pilots knew that they were not facing a catastrophic failure, but the engine was clearly compromised. At this point, the air traffic controller at LAX informed the pilots that he could still see flames shooting from the engine, which added to the tension in the cockpit. The captain had experienced an engine surge before, but it was always in the controlled environment of a simulator. This was real, and the stakes were much higher. The captain declared a pan to air traffic control, an indication that the situation was serious, but not yet life-threatening. The aircraft needed help, but there was no immediate danger to the lives of the passengers. The controller directed the pilots to climb to 5,000 feet and remain within the vicinity of the airport while they assessed the situation. The pilots followed the instructions, and the aircraft was stabilized. The crew now faced a crucial decision. Should they return to Los Angeles and land, or should they continue the flight to London as originally planned? The decision to continue the flight was not one taken lightly. The first officer and captain discussed their options thoroughly. British Airways policy dictated that, as long as the aircraft was in a safe condition, the decision to continue the flight would be up to the captain. However, there were many factors to consider. The first issue was fuel. The pilots knew that they had enough fuel to continue the flight to London, but how much fuel would they have left by the time they arrived? Three engines were still functioning, and the fuel consumption would be higher than normal due to the loss of one engine. The Flight Management Computer, FMC, calculated that they would have 7 tons of fuel remaining upon arrival at Heathrow, which was above the minimum required amount for landing. But there were other concerns. The flight to London would take them over vast stretches of ocean, with no nearby airports for diversion. What if the engine failure worsened? Or what if the surge had caused more damage than initially realized? The pilots knew that they were not in a straightforward situation, but they had no reason to believe that continuing the flight would put the aircraft or passengers in immediate danger. In addition to managing the technical aspects of the flight, the pilots had to ensure that the passengers were kept informed and that the airline's operations department was in the loop. The captain sent the first officer to speak with the chief flight attendant, asking her to monitor the cabin and keep the passengers calm. At the same time, The first officer was tasked with assessing any visible damage from the passenger windows, as the pilots had limited visibility from the cockpit. The first officer's trip to the cabin was met with mixed reactions from passengers. Some had noticed flames coming from the engine during takeoff, and a few passengers, including one who was a pilot, mentioned that they thought it had been an engine surge. These observations were useful for the crew, confirming that the engine had indeed surged, but without causing significant damage. Meanwhile, in the cockpit, the pilots continued to monitor the engine's condition. They could see that Engine 2 was windmilling normally, meaning it had not suffered structural damage, and no fire was present. This reassured the crew, but they were still cautious. The flight to Heathrow would require a delicate balance of fuel management, technical troubleshooting, and careful planning to ensure that they would arrive safely.